I want to thank everybody for joining us for today's webinar entitled Driving Growth Through Digital Quality and Compliance, presented by Astrix Technology. And Michael Zachowski is our presenter for today. We can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So a couple of things before we get into the content. I want to take a couple of minutes and at least explain to you all, if you're not familiar with who Astrix is yet, we want to let you know who we are and what our role is in this industry. So real quick, from a company snapshot perspective, we successfully deliver highly specialized services, processes, technology, as well as outsourced services to fundamentally transform how science-based businesses operate. This is all done in an effort to improve scientific outcomes and the lives of people everywhere. And a couple of quick statistics about the company. We were established back in 1995, privately held. We originated as the IT division of a company called APBI, Life Science Research Organization. We operate from 7 offices in the United States and beautiful Costa Rica, and our headquarters are in Red Bank, New Jersey. Astrix is a market leader in dedicated digital transformation services and expert outsourced services for the scientific community. The type of customers we help: Fortune 1000 life science enterprises, chemical, CPG, government and research institutions, all typically with large and fast-growing IT, outsourced, and compliance needs. Now, in terms of where, you can go to the next slide, please. In terms of what we offer, in terms of a solutions set, the services span the complete life cycle of scientific data systems needs. This includes everything from the business process analysis and enterprise architecture phase. This is basically where we're brought in by a company to help them understand what their technology needs are going to be based on the type of company they are, the type of infrastructure they have in place, and where they're trying to get to. So we're really there to kind of help them understand what their laboratory or R&D stack or compliance stack needs to look like. From there, we can help with lab and quality management system selections. So we can go out and help you choose the best technology solutions in a very agnostic way. We then can help with development and implementation, which is where we design and implement your systems on time and within budget. From there, we can finish it up with ensuring your systems meet regulatory compliance by offering complete computer systems validation. And then finally, when your system is deployed and validated, we have expert services to optimize the quality of operations while ensuring compliance through our digital quality services, as well as on-demand specialized staffing. So we have both scientific and technical on-demand staffing. So if you need to bring people in on a short-term or long-term basis, we can help with that. Now, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. We can go to the next slide, please. Michael Zachowski is our Director of Digital Quality and Compliance here at Astrix. He's a solution-oriented senior life sciences pro with 20-plus years of advisory experience helping companies deliver compliance-focused business process improvement solutions and quality and manufacturing systems implementations globally. With specialties in leadership, program, project management, regulatory compliance, technology solutions, and business process design, experience in his years includes complex large-scale projects, IT strategy development, operating model development, as well as program management office, mergers and acquisitions, integration methodologies, and more. So we've got a gentleman with a great scope of experience, and I'm going to go ahead and turn the mic over to you, Vamsi. I'll come back on at the end to wrap us up, but the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kevin. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's digital quality by itself is something that a lot of companies and organizations are focusing on, and it is now becoming more of a necessity rather than an aspiration as your business processes change and evolve, and you start getting into technologies that are emerging that have to be optimized, and also making sure that you are dealing with a very complex, distributed, and a global network of systems and compliance requirements, and obviously product and quality requirements that you have. Now, the whole digital quality aspect rests on a couple of key foundational elements, and agreeing upon that roadmap as to how you're going to drive the digital quality function is very pertinent to driving growth in the organization itself. For example, about 16% of organizations today have clear and compelling connection between quality and corporate strategy, just 16%. Now, the other 84% is where there needs to be some work, right? We need to make sure that people recognize the value that digital quality and compliance brings to the organization as a whole across the enterprise, and also understand what that looks like from the roadmap perspective. What are some of the considerations? So what we'll spend some time today is a couple of things. One, we'll talk about investments in the digital capabilities as a foundation for growth. We'll talk briefly about some of the technology trends that we see out in the marketplace. Third, we'll also go in and look at some of the processes that we need to look at, and how we need to tweak some of our existing processes to gain the efficiencies that we're talking about. And finally, also understanding how we go in and optimize the adoption of these digital tools and processes to support compliance. So having said that, what do we mean by digital quality in the first place? What does digital quality encompass, right? The first thing is we look at it as a quality transformation. It by far, in our experience working with various clients across the industry, is the single most important initiative within organizations today. And it's not just going in and improving productivity of the organization, but also making sure that you're driving the business impact that you can get from a digital quality implementation. And the other important aspect of it is, as you're transforming your quality organization, it improves all levels of quality maturity, not just one area, but across the enterprise. And also gives you the opportunity to build a culture of quality across the organization. The second piece of digital quality is technologies. I'm sure there are a lot of buzzwords you hear: AI, ML, NLP, cognitive, cloud, elastic computing, digital twins. All of this has to be leveraged as you start transforming quality into digital quality. Digital quality is not just, taking a single process and digitizing it, so to speak. It's more across the board. And as I mentioned before, the key focus has to be on the enterprise versus just one single process or one single silo. Now, all of this can happen when your focus shifts from deliverables to data and data analytics, right? You have to make sure the data is core to that transformation. You have to make sure that when you start going in and looking at how you organize your operating model, for example, data is central to that operating model. And doing this will let you establish and recognize and also use closed loop data flows. What do we mean by that? We might want to make sure that the data is flowing seamlessly within systems across the organization, across departments, across regions, across sectors. The data has to be easily available and easily digestible to the right people, by the right people, and for the right people. And lastly, the quality organization by itself has to move away from being a reactive organization to becoming more of a proactive organization. For example, you want to make sure that the quality organization is more in front of the data rather than behind the data. So you want to be able to predict, for example, kappas and non-conformances based on the data analysis and the analytics that you build, so that you don't have to actually go through the process. You can prevent that whole workflow from kicking in if you're able to make informed decisions on your data. So what are some of those trends that we are seeing that's driving that shift, right, as organizations move? So for example, 23% of organizations that we talk to have already started some of these initiatives, right? And digitization of quality management through the application of traditional and emerging technologies. That's what is driving, because you're moving from your traditional way of delivering quality to a digital format. You're moving, like I said, keeping data in the heart and center of your transformation. And when we talk to clients, a couple of things that stand out. One is the silos, for lack of a better word, across the quality organization. Business quality versus IT quality versus product quality versus supplier quality. Now, all of these are doing their job, but they're doing it in silos. The second thing is leveraging of technology. There are multiple systems serving each one of these processes, and for example, even automating some of those processes, but not across the enterprise. They're again within those siloed buckets. And lastly, I think the other thing that clients talk to us about is the skill sets, right? It is no longer somebody with just the quality background. You want to have within the quality organization people who understand data. You want data scientists, you want analytics people, you want to have people who have an IT bent of mind to understand the technology and make sure the technology is being leveraged to the maximum to drive efficiencies across the organization. The other thing that we see from a shift is the strategy, right? There's a lot of strategy that we see that is set at the higher level, but execution is again in silos and it's not tied back to the strategy. So there's a lot of organizations that are going behind what we call the shiny new objects. Oh, I want to have this fancy looking analytics dashboard, spend a lot of effort and resources developing those analytics and dashboards, but then is it really tying back to your quality strategy and your data strategy and your digitization strategy? That's where people are lacking. And then also making sure that there is learning and transparency within the organization as you start working through these use cases. The one thing with use cases is there's a whole bunch of them, but how do you make sure you're giving it the right impetus and you're giving it the right focus to make sure it's fit for purpose? And what do we mean by fit for purpose? We're basically going in and saying use case for company A might be different from use case for company B, even though they're in the same realm, let's say kappas or non-conformances. The way that company A does kappas versus company B does kappas might be different. So your use cases have to be fit for purpose. They have to make sure you're getting the ROI that you've defined and you expect. And you have to be able to be agile and tweak it as you go through and start working through those use cases. So for us to be able to get to digital quality, what should organizations start looking at? I think one is definitely leverage the digital technologies that are out there. As I mentioned before, there are a plethora of solutions built on the digital platforms today: AI, cloud, NLP, digital twins, for example, is huge when it comes to quality, especially in the manufacturing segment. And then you start looking at moving away from on-prem applications to hosted applications and SaaS solutions and things like that, where you're making sure that you're able to leverage a lot of the advantages that those technologies provide into your business processes. The second thing is also paying attention to what is happening from a regulatory perspective. Right? For example, the FDA today has shown an acceptance of real world data and their ability to use that data as part of quality conversations. And as you start navigating the complex web of global regulations, it's very critical that you understand what that guidances or regulations mean to your company, to your organization, and the way that you are working within your quality organization. The EU MDR, the GDPR, SAMDs, all these have been dealt with across the regulatory agencies in similar fashion, but with their own nuances depending on which regulatory agency you look at. But understanding what those nuances are and what is that impact of those regulatory guidances on your products and your processes is critical. The third thing is we talked about use cases, right? Understand that you cannot boil the ocean. You have to be able to take it one step at a time and look at use cases across the organization, across the enterprise, and use the use cases, as I mentioned before, the fit for purpose use cases, to demonstrate the power of data and the impact that it has on the business processes. No quality organization can be successful unless they start looking at it from a business perspective. What is the value that the organization drives for the business? Why should quality be a profit center rather than a cost center? That's the whole mentality that needs to change. And while doing this, work in tandem with transformational areas within the industry itself, right? Understand where is the maximum amount of investment that is being made across the industry, supply chain, clinical. Make sure that your use cases are working in tandem with those transformational areas, because that is where the business wants to focus on. We might want to go in and create a brand new doc management system, but if that is not in line with the way that your business wants to operate, it might add efficiencies to your process, but the business is not going to partner very willingly with it. Rather spend time working on product complaints, supplier management, vendor management, because this is what, if nothing, the last 14, 15 months with the pandemic has taught us is the business has to pivot, and it has to pivot very fast, still maintaining all their metrics, all their KPIs, and all their requirements from a supplier perspective and a vendor perspective. So make sure that as you're working through these use cases, you're working with the business to define both what the use case is, what is the expected ROI, and what is the efficiency that you will bring to the overall process. So why should we move in the first place, right? What we've talked about how we should move, but why should we move? In a lot of our conversations, it can come down to three major buckets. One is the data quality. As I mentioned before, data has to be heart of how you go about through digitization of the organization. So when we talk about data quality, I mentioned this briefly, the reconciliation of data, right? Data from one system versus data from another system for a similar process are not the same, or they're showing you two different views based on which system you're looking at. And once you start getting into a common data platform and you start looking at data in a single fashion, that reconciliation becomes less of a headache. The next thing is the lack of metrics, right? When we talk about metrics, it is not just uptime, downtime from an IT perspective when you talk about systems, but it's more, what are the metrics that are actually impacting your business from a quality perspective? Do we have a line of sight into those metrics? And are we in a way tweaking those metrics to make sure that they are more accurate? And this is where some of those use cases can come in, right? Your RPA, your ML, you deploy solutions that will give you more meaningful metrics as you start talking and looking at those metrics. And finally, from a data perspective, the transparency, right? Data is not to be hoarded by one group or one set of people. Data has to be readily available across the organization. And studies have shown that the more transparent the data is, the more impactful the actions are based on that data. The second bucket as to why we should move is more from a technology and people perspective. One of the biggest trends that we're seeing is the quality organization moving from ensuring compliance to actually helping manage compliance. Now, the difference between the two words is ensuring comes across as a cop, manage is more as a coach. You want to make sure you're working with the business hand in hand as they go through the process and helping them drive compliance. You don't want to go in with a stick later on, so to speak. The second piece of it is, as your solutions are getting more complex, you have to understand that they have to be customer-facing solutions. You have to be able to look at solutions not just from a quality angle, but maybe your business partners and even the company's customers. What would they want to see? What are they looking for? That solution has to be all-encompassing. And as I mentioned before, the informed decision-making based on the data, based on what you're driving, based on an understanding of what that data is telling you. And therefore, communicating it to all areas within the enterprise across the organization, communicating the importance of these initiatives, communicating what it is to make sure that your suppliers, your vendors, your product related data, what does it do for you from a quality perspective? And lastly, when you start building out your digitization roadmap, you have to think about, number one, and most critically, centralized data. Data that is in one location or a location that can be readily accessible by different systems and different organizations across the enterprise. And you have to be able to move from just a pilot phase for most of these projects to what we call further down, right? You have to kick the ball a little further. You cannot just stay in pilot. You have to be agile enough to make sure that you have multiple releases, for example, of your systems, of your applications. And you have to keep building based on what you learn from each one of these. So what does that framework look like, right? So when you start looking at a framework, there is multiple aspects of it, and I'll spend a little time talking through each one of these, and we'll go 1 through 6. From an EQMS perspective, the Enterprise Quality Management System, it's critical that you have an enterprise quality management system and not siloed quality management systems. Why is that critical? EQMS enables the quality information to be collected as data. And that data is therefore the basis upon which a lot of decisions are made. The EQMS also has to go in and allow you to go interface with other systems, whether it is your ERP, whether it is your PLM, whether it is your supplier quality, whether it is vendor management, whatever it might be, those interfaces are critical because that is where your data is sitting. And you, as a quality organization, as you start looking at digitization and digital quality by itself, have to have access to that data so you can make better decisions. And the last point on the EQMS piece is mobility, right? You do not want this stuck to one particular location or region or within one area. EQMS has to give you the ability to look at data wherever, whenever, and however you want to look at. Now, for that to happen, you have to transition, right? You have to go in and move from a deliverable mindset to a data mindset. Now, what does that mean? Quality organizations have always been branded, so to speak, as only focus on deliverables, right? Do you have this document ready? Do you have that document signed off? Did you get everything? Yes, that is a very important aspect of it. But when you're thinking transitions from just worrying about a deliverable to the actual data that is driving a lot of those deliverables, there's a lot of efficiencies and improvements that you can identify and focus on. And that data will actually be available once you start putting it in a centralized data model, right? You have to move away from, as I mentioned before, the silos to a centralized data model. Now, what does the centralized data model give you? It gives you more access and better access for not only your organization, but maybe even your customers. And that is what people are looking for, that access. And that brings us to connected, right? You have to make sure that your systems across the enterprise are linked. I cannot stress enough, most of our silos have to be broken down and bridged through these connections. You have to be able to have interoperability of data. And that data is not just limited to one piece of data. It's your supplier data, your product data, your process data, your metrics, right? Everything has to be linked, because unless you have a holistic picture and view of that data, the decisions you make are still going to be flawed. For example, 90% of products in compliance with your EQMS is where you want to get to. That's where your target should be. There will still be a 10% gap, and that is fine. Obviously, the utopian view is 100%, but realistically, 90% should be there. And what does this do, right? It basically reduces your cost of poor quality. And based on statistics, it's at least a 2 to 5% drop once you start implementing an EQMS and you start connecting systems. You'll see a drop in your cost of poor quality. The fourth aspect of the digital quality framework is your availability. As I mentioned before, data was held as though it was an asset only for the need to know basis. That has to change. You have to be able to provide data based on role, process area, location, across the board. Everybody has to have access to that data. And the minute you start breaking down those walls, so to speak, is when you see a jump in your efficiencies and process compliance, because now people are making decisions with the data that you want them to look at before making a decision. And what does this do? You're basically going in and empowering your organization. Whether it is people, you're giving them technology and tools to make the right decisions and to help them make the right decisions. And you're going in and tweaking your processes to help drive that decision making and reduce your cost of quality. So you're not going in and repeating, you're not going in and doing the same thing across 3 different organizations within your enterprise. And finally, I think analytics has to be there that sits on top of this data. Analytics is just not a bunch of dashboards. Analytics is being able to go in and understand where and how you're looking at data and making sure that you are moving, like I said, from reactive to proactive. You're making decisions based on data that you have on your processes that can prevent quality incidents, that can prevent, for example, a kappa or a non-conformance. Looking at trends, right? For example, you have multiple ERP systems. If there are a lot of deviations on the validation of one of your ERP systems, is it because people are not trained enough? Is it because people don't understand the process that you put in? Is it because people don't have the right access, therefore they're trying to go around? That's what your data will tell you. If left alone, that will end up in a kappa, in a non-conformance, which is a much longer journey to take than to just go in and say, this is a very simple fix now because I'm looking at the data that I should be looking at. Finally, there is a lot of talk about quality 4.0. Right? Quality 4.0 stems from industry 4.0, right? Industrial revolution 1, 2, 3, and now 4. And what is the heart of 4.0? It's data, right? You have to go in and start moving away from your traditional way of doing quality. You have to go in and deliver quality at a much faster pace because that's what the business and the customers are looking for. You have to shift from traditional quality. Quality 4.0 is more a union of an intersection rather of traditional quality, analytics, and your technology. That's what it should be. You should have components of each one of these that will give you those aspects as you move through your digitization journey. And for digitization to be effective, you have to be able to define the business benefits. Right? You have to sit with the business stakeholders. You have to have a focused conversation on making sure that they are clear on what they want, you understand what they want, and you're setting the process up for them to get those benefits. It might not happen overnight, but as long as you're looking at it and you're tweaking your changes and your updates based on those expectations, you will get those ROIs. We talked about use cases. Start with something simple, right? Do not go in and say, we're going to change the way that we do a lot of our whole kappa or non-conformance process, for example. Start with something simple, right? Maybe it's RPA to identify and report kappas, because we get it through systems, we collect all the data, and then we report them. There's RPA available to do that now. You can use that as a simple use case. And believe me, as you start looking at that use case, it will show you opportunities where there are other process steps that you can start looking into once you finish this step. And that's how you start building your use case. Your pilot becomes a project, your project becomes a program. And that's the way it should go. And also understand that digitization is not just limited to quality, right? It has to work in tandem with where the organization and the enterprise is going, where the IT organization is going. And you have to go in and work hand in hand to use that technology to drive optimization and efficiencies across the enterprise. It's not just from a quality focus. Please keep that in mind. And look at what is happening outside of your organization. I mean, there are a lot of industry groups, there are a lot of conversations that we can have with people outside, right? For example, the processing of kappas that I talked about earlier stemmed from an idea where people were using RPA to process loan applications. That's how it came in. But they were able to modify that RPA process to move it into the kappa realm, saying the data is similar in the way that it is captured and what has to be looked at. It's pretty standard. So we can use RPA in that situation. So look at what others in the industry are doing, what your peers are doing, and maybe outside of the industry also, right? To build that use case for digitization. And from a culture of quality perspective, focus on the leadership and the processes that are enterprise-wide. You doing digitization for one process in one location might be a good pilot, but the focus has to be what can we do across the enterprise, because that is when you will have buy-in from both your IT and business together, and you can get there faster. And for you to define that ROI, define the real value that you have, right? Your focus has to be improved quality, has to be efficiency of your processes, and ultimately, what is the cost that you associate with the quality? It has to you have to be able to define the value in those three parameters at a minimum. So finally, I think we can all agree that digital quality cannot be a differentiator anymore, right? It's a necessity. And it has to be used to propel the organization by leveraging the technology, by using the power of data and analytics all combined, and making sure that you're banking upon your traditional quality processes to give you what is right, what is workable for you, and what is achievable for you. So Kevin, I think we'll take a pause and see if there's any questions here.
Great, thank you very much for that. Appreciate it, and appreciate a great presentation for sure, Vamsi. Let me do a couple things here. Let me go ahead and get the recording stopped.